Hi, Hunter Hastings here. We're going to be talking today about change, and we're also going to incorporate a term that you might come across in business called change management. Now, we're Austrian economists, and we know that the future is uncertain, it can't be predicted, it certainly can't be managed, and therefore the concept of change management doesn't ring true with us. But it certainly does in corporate America, where change management has become a big consulting practice. It's become a standard way of implementing processes. It has steps and it has offices, and it's become a fixture in business. We're going to meet today Nellie Wartoft. Nellie is the founder and the CEO of TigerHall, which is a platform, a software platform, for helping corporations not to manage change, but to activate it. And that's a very different concept, as we'll hear. TigerHall is quite brilliant and quite revolutionary in how it goes about it. Nellie is also the chairperson of the board of the Executive Council for Leading Change. And so she's talking to corporations and leaders throughout the world thinking about this issue. She's the most informed and the most insightful on change in business. So let's meet her.
This is the Value Creators Podcast. Value creation is the sole purpose of any business and every business, and for all of us as entrepreneurs. Listen to great value creators as they share their successes, trials, and lessons learned. Join us as we explore how to think as value creators, how to act as value creators, and how to view business through the lens of value creation.
Nellie, welcome to the Value Creators Podcast.
Thank you, Hunter. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great for you to be here. We really appreciate it. One of the things we've been concerned with a lot when we're thinking about business is change. I think I've heard you say that change is the only constant. We like to think about it philosophically. Heraclitus said, you never step in the same river twice because it's not the same river and you're not the same person. And that's the kind of spirit that we like to think about. But business seems to have a problem with change, and they like predictability, they like consistency, they like structure, they like things to be within a box, within a strategy, and so change for them is kind of a challenge. So I thought we'd start by talking about that duality. Change is everywhere, but change is hard to manage. I think you also have told me that there's more change that employees and managers are facing now than ever before. Is that right?
Yeah, that is absolutely right. And it's happened a lot just over the last 10 years. And there's some good Gartner research around this that in 2014, which seems like it was 1 year ago, but it's already 10 years ago.
Yeah.
In 2014, we had the average employee experiencing around one change per year. And that meant that they were usually pretty excited about it. Employee engagement and support for transformation was close to 80%. And then fast forward 10 years, that one change a year has now turned into close to 14 changes a year. So every month there is something new. And that has led to this culture in many organizations of a flavor of the month kind of culture. And there might be some new executive coming in, having their change. And people are just thinking we're just going to ride past it and let it go on. And then it's going to be something else next month. So why care about this change, right? Mm-hmm. So that means that we're seeing employee support and engagement in change having dropped from that close to 80% to now close to 30%. So there's a massive gap between where we need employees to be in terms of supporting the change, because without employees being on board and actually executing the change is never going to happen. So contrary to what many people believe, change is not happening in the beautiful PowerPoint slides that you create during the strategy and planning phase, right? But the actual change is taking place when that plan hits the people, and things start to take action in reality. So that's a very big gap, which is referred to the change activation gap. And yeah, it's more and more happening. It's just going to continue to increase, right? It's going to be more and more change. That 14 is not going to drop back to 1, but it might be 28 changes per employee per year in 2034. So we'll see much more happening.
Just to give it some context for people listening, Nellie, you include in change a wide range of things: new jobs, new products, reorganization, restructuring. Right? We're talking about every change that impacts an individual doing that job in a company.
Yeah, correct. So it could be technology implementation, could
Yeah.
be mergers, acquisitions, divestitures, cultural transformation, leadership changes, new CEO coming in, usually leading to a lot of changes. So any change that impacts the way you do your job on a day-to-day basis and how you do your job on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Okay, and then how do people feel about change? I always shudder at the word transformation because I don't think anybody wants to be transformed. It doesn't sound good. And
I don't
there's
think anyone wants to be changed either.
right. Well, that's an important point. We call it subjective value. How do people feel about these things, let alone the mechanics of change? You've dealt with a lot of these change situations. How do people feel about change? Do they embrace it, or do they hate it, or somewhere in between?
So I think it's a bit sad that like the change curve is actually taken from the grief curve. So the way that people deal with grief, like the initial shock, then goes into denial, then acceptance, then grief, like all of those things is actually from like the way that humans grieve. And
Yeah.
that many times is applied to change, which I think is sad in itself and also a bit unfair to like many people are actually pretty excited about change. I think there's a perception that people are very negative to change and resistant to change and people hate it. And I think it's important to remember that based on human biology and the way that our brains are wired, the first reaction is always going to be caution and like resistance, if you call it, if you want to call it that. So it's always going to be something along those lines as the initial reaction. And that's completely natural. And I think leaders need to understand that that's a natural human reaction, is not something they should take personally or see as an obstacle. It's just like how humans react to something new. And that's really hardwired in our brains. So from that lens, you could say that, yeah, people hate change or they don't like it. But then a lot of people actually thrive on change as well. And so many people need contrast, they need new experiences, they need adventures, and people actually love change to a big part as well, as long as, of course, it doesn't impact them negatively. So if you look at there's a matrix around how people are perceiving change based on one, is it positive or negative for them? And two, do they have the power to influence it or not? And in that matrix, usually, as long as people feel like they have a voice and they have a say and they have some level of power in influencing the change, they're more than happy to support it as long as they feel heard. When people start to hate change, and where that perception comes from, is usually this approach that is one way, top down. We don't hear you. We don't care what you have to say. This is just something you have to do. And you take people's agency away. And when you take people's agency away, when you take their voice away, that's when people start hating change. And that's the same, I mean,
Yeah.
for you and I, right? If someone would tell us that, hey, like you need to change the way you do this now, but you have nothing to say in that process, that would not feel great. So that's usually where that resistance comes from many times. So it's not necessarily the change itself, but it's about how they feel treated during that change process that influences it more than anything.
Yeah. One of the ways economists try to think about that, Nellie, is that they look at it through the lens of uncertainty, that the future's uncertain. You can't predict it. You don't know what's going to happen. It's wrong to try. And that the solution for that is action. Do something, see what happens, and then react to that. So I'm trying to relate that strain of economics to your change activation. So talk to us about change activation, how you see that as different, new, and better than the way that change management has usually been done.
Yeah, so change activation is that very crucial piece that comes after strategy and planning. And looking at what you mentioned earlier in the episode around how most transformation and change is still failing, it's still around that 70 to 80% mark, according to most consulting firms that are failing. And the reason for that is usually not that the strategy was wrong or the plan was wrong, or like that could of course happen as well, but it's usually coming down to the activation. And when I say activation, I talk about communications, capability building, and culture activation, and having those three components being done right. And those 3 components being done right is what allows people to execute, to deliver, to actually drive that change and take action, to your point. Because change is not something that you have on a PowerPoint deck, right? It's something that is changing in how people work and how people collaborate and what they do on a day-to-day basis. So until they have changed that, your change has actually not happened. So that's why the activation piece is so critical, and having that done right. And then to your point on like taking action, also having the two-way feedback loops and data on what is actually happening when people take action. Because it's just like, and I'm a big believer of this, that strategy doesn't inform execution, execution informs strategy. So to be able to create a great strategy, you need to execute a ton and see what works, what doesn't work, how are people reacting to different things, how are customers reacting to different things, and then build your strategy based on that, right? So you need to test, experiment, and see what works. And that's why the action part is so critical. And even more critical than that is, how do you know what works and doesn't? So having those data, two-way feedback loops, the analysis of what's happening in the action phase is equally important. But yeah, that's why change activation is so critical, because that's actually where the change is taking place.
Yeah. So we have big debates about this, Nellie, how companies actually work. And we're advocates of autonomy and freedom. So in your context, that's the individuals or maybe teams. You can tell us about they're doing the activation, they're acting, they're doing things. What's the role for management or the planners that you talked about? How do you just turn individuals loose? Do you guide them? Do you give them a palette to work from? Tell us how it works.
Yeah, so I think change management, or like the planners, to your point, like people are making sure execution is done right. Like the role is very much a guiding role, and ensuring that people know what is expected of them, and guiding and also coordinating and influencing. Those are the 3 aspects. And when I say coordinating, for to like making sure that people have an understanding across the different aspects of the change, and that leaders are communicating the same message, for example, that you don't have 10 different leaders communicating about the change in 10 different ways, and making sure that it's a united message, and also that people are understood and that they are being heard. So I think the change management, like, is not so much about change, like managing change and managing that process. Is more about guiding, influencing, coordinating, and making sure that everyone is part of it in the way that they should, and holding people accountable to their particular role in the change as well. So if you're a leader, making sure that you are communicating in the right way and that you're delivering on your part of influencing people to change the way that they take their actions to drive that change forward.
Yeah, I picked up a phrase from you in another interview that you did, and you said you should change with the organization rather than against it. And that really resonated with me, because a lot of change management is imposed, right? Transformation is something you impose on people. You make them comply with the transformation rules, or however you express it. So maybe it's top down versus bottom up, as you say, but what did you mean when you said change with the organization?
It's very much about driving change that people are part of, and like making people part of that change so that they are on board. So that is not about driving it against them, where, that very much top down approach, telling them what to do. And it's kind of creating these 2 camps where you would have employer against employee in many scenarios. And I think that divide between employer and employee has just continued to grow wider. And there are more and more people thinking of like us and them, and it's the employer versus the employee, especially around things like, return to office mandates, or anything around, like, from pandemic onwards, feels like this has been magnified. So it's about how do we come together as a unit and being together in driving this change, and not having this us and them where top leadership decides what's going to change and then just communicating that top down to everyone else that this is now what you need to do differently. So that's the purpose of that with them, instead of just against them. So it's not 2 camps, it's actually just 1 camp, and having people come together.
So you've made a service business, Nellie, out of this different way, revolutionary way, really, of looking at change, how to avoid the 2 camps. I like that imagery. So tell us about your business, and maybe this is time to introduce TigerHall to us.
Yeah, TigerHall is a software business. So it's not a service business, but it's a software platform for driving change activation. And what it does is it helps leaders drive communications and capability building and culture activation. So those three components are all part of the platform. And it helps them to create content that is engaging. So the communications and the capability building is done in ways that are short, succinct, bite-sized, to the point, and leverages formats that people are used to outside of work. So instead of sending out more PDFs and PowerPoint decks, it's about how do we engage people through short-form videos, through live streams, through podcasts, and different formats that are more consumer influenced, and then having that reaching the right people. So lots of targeting, audience segmentation, making sure that people only receive what they should receive, and it's not this one size fits none message where everyone receives the same 400 emails and
Right.
just ignores 399 of them and never open the rest. So making sure that people get what's for them, and then having that integrated in the flow of work so that they get it at the right time when they need it in the workflow they're working in. And then what leaders get from this is the two-way feedback loops. So people can share and ask follow-up questions and share their input, their ideas, and give feedback, which helps you understand where are the issues across the organization and what do I need to address earlier, and like how do I catch problems early. And then you also get a lot of data and analytics around it. So it's an ongoing loop, where you see how people are reacting to it, what are the problems you need to catch, what is the data and analytics around the change, and how can you be agile to continue steering that change to where it needs to go. So that's the platform that we've built, that is used by large enterprises in their transformation initiatives.
Yeah. Well, it's brilliant. There's a lot to dig into there. One is the form of communication. So, as you say, it's the forms that we communicate with each other in real life, right? TikTok type and podcasts like this, and so on. And has that been resisted by corporations traditionally, or is it embraced? You would think that a lot of tech corporations would be embracing that kind of platform.
Yeah, it has been very embraced, because it stands out, right? Like in a world of emails and PDFs and PowerPoint decks and so much noise, and where everything pretty much looks the same. It's in 99% of the cases, it's written English text. Having that, for example, being able to listen to it in your local language as a podcast, or seeing it in just a 2-minute video summarizing the key points, those are the kind of formats that are breaking through in that noise of corporate communications. So it does really resonate, and especially with companies that are large, that are very complex, that are difficult for people to navigate. Like having that breaking through has been something that large enterprises have been adopting.
And who produces the content? How do you decide on one message and then decide how to express it through all those different channels and forms? How does that content creation process work?
So there are a few different ways. So customers can either upload a PowerPoint or a PDF or like any material they already have, and then it turns into podcast power reads in people's local languages. So that's a conversion from existing content they have. Many also produce new. So it's as easy as picking up your phone, recording a quick video, and speaking to the camera, which is the kind of format that works best and resonates the most with people. And then they can just publish that. And then we also have an arm called TigerHall Studios, where we work with our customers and supporting them in content creation. So we have full-on podcasting teams, video editors, writers, and so on that come in and work with their executives, change champions, or anyone else who's the messenger, and creating those high quality, high engagement content pieces. So there are different ways of creating content depending on purpose and bandwidth and time and priorities.
And are there any rules about who can produce the content, or what they can say in those content pieces? How do you manage that?
Yeah. So that's something that the organization sets themselves, and that's where we see quite a bit of a difference. Like some organizations set, for example, it's only senior leadership can create content and can share. So that tends to be in more top-down environments. Tends to work somewhat like not as great. And then you have other organizations that do everyone can share, and like anyone can go on there and share anything that's on their mind. That could also risk becoming a bit messy. So somewhere in between is usually the best, where the organization sets these are the individuals that are allowed to share, and then position that as a little bit of a semi-promotion in a way, where people would then feel seen, they feel recognized, they get this special role to be a change champion or be an influencer internally in the organization, and then you give them the special tools for them to be able to do that. So that in between is what we see works best, because then you have that network that you trust, and you can still have those peers, and people can hear from people on the ground and people that they know. It doesn't all have to come from change management team or from top leadership, because we know that that's the kind of content that resonates the least. But you still remain having some control, and it doesn't just become like a chaotic Facebook type of experience or similar.
Yeah. Is there targeting? I need this message to go to the marketing department. I need this message to go to production in Spain. Can you target those kinds of messages?
Yeah, absolutely. So you have dynamic audience groups where you just set the criteria, like everyone who has been in the company for this length of time, or sits in this geography, or belongs to this function, or reports into this manager should receive this message, for example. So you just set the criteria, and then that's automatically going out to the right people. And you can also base that on activity or workflow. So let's say you're doing an ERP implementation, and then you can see that, oh, this is when person X is starting this workflow, or let's say the performance module, for example, and you might launch the ERP in January, but the performance module is not being used until October. So then when people are starting to use that module, that's when they receive the relevant communication. So you can also target based on time, based on activity, based on sentiment. So the sentiment data that you get out of the platform, you can use that for targeting. So everyone who's more skeptical to the change, maybe you want to send a different message to the ones that are all gung-ho, all in, let's do this. So that's also differentiators you can use to get the right type of messaging to the right audience. And much of that is automated. So you set it up once, and then depending on how people change and move throughout that change curve and within the organization, they then receive the right communications and capability building automatically.
We're delighted to announce the Value Creators online course. For entrepreneurs in every kind of business, big, small, or medium, at every stage, in every industry, our course provides the foundations and principles on which to build success. Simple, clear purpose and principles give rise to creativity, innovation, and competitively superior business action. There are 11 foundational principles or mental models that together cohere into the value business model. Principles for value generation, principles for value operations, principles for value finance and accounting, and principles for value sustainability, as well as the new knowledge accumulation you'll need for continuous innovation. These principles are delivered by top business professors from top business schools: Mark Packard, Per Byland, Gordon Miller, David Rapp, and Bart Vanderhagen. You'll find video lessons from them, along with downloadable tools, processes, and other valuable content. Master these lessons, and you'll master the most important skill in business: value creation. Go to thevaluecreators.com and click the course link. So would you call that artificial intelligence induced, the data analytics and the decision making about who gets what message? Is that AI aided?
Yeah, there are some components of AI in it, like the sentiment analysis is AI driven, the targeting is AI driven. Parts of it is like what do you call it? Not machine learning, but like based on just data rules. So it's not AI, but it's pure machine learning. And then some of it is definitely AI, and the things like content generation, content summaries, a lot of that is AI infused as well.
Yeah, I like that trend. We look to AI to be team members, and now you've got AI as the communications HR department or some designation like that. We're looking forward to the AI CEO. Nellie.
Yeah, I think that would be great. That's what we really need. Better CEOs, I think, is the key.
Right. So the other side of modern communication, of the type that you've just described, as self-selection. I, as an individual, can select what I like and what I think I want to read or listen to or watch. And you're trying to target me on one side based on my sentiment. I'm trying to self-select on the other side. How do you rationalize that? Can you monitor someone's self-selection and then supplement it or guide it?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can see what people select, what they're drawn to, like how they want to consume the content, what time they consume content, what type of content they consume, who are they influenced by. So all of that data you have, you get access to, and then you can then use that data also for targeting, right? And you can have, like, on the point of self-selection, people would usually do about 50% self-selection and 50% what is assigned to them, and that's also helpful. So you can guide and curate to a certain extent, and then even within that guiding and curating, people can then self-select within that guidance. So that's
Okay.
another way to use it. But yeah, it tends to be around 50-50.
So, can you describe to us a success story without giving away the name of a client or anything that would do that? Where you've been involved and you've felt good about. We understand the before problem. We got to a good after, and here was the process in between, and here's how we learned and tweaked. Can you just guide us through that as an example?
Yeah, so one example would be a large consumer goods giant that we worked with, and they were going through a divestiture. So they were splitting the company in two, and of course that leads to a lot of uncertainty on employees' part around, do I have a job or not, and what am I supposed to do, and lower productivity usually when people are uncertain of the future. So we worked with them on all the communications around that change, and making sure that people knew what was happening at all times, and that they felt enabled to drive that change through. Because a big part of it is also enabling people to have the right skill sets, the knowledge, the mindsets for eventual new roles that they're getting into. So that was another big piece, and that led to people being very involved and engaged in that change, and they felt invested in, they felt heard. And coming back to what I mentioned earlier, with giving people a voice, that's usually the single biggest differentiator, that you can do during change, is just making sure that people have a voice. So before, they would do what most organizations do. You have emails, you have SharePoint sites, and you put information out there in usually PDF, PowerPoint type of formats. And then you have the town halls, where many organizations have their chat turned off in town hall. So that's not another avenue to ask questions either. And then everything just becomes cascaded through middle managers all the way to their managers, all the way down to their direct reports. So instead of doing that, they then had direct communication with the end employee, the frontline employee, and could hear their voices and their concerns in real time, which allowed them to then address those challenges and speak very credibly around what was changing, but also what isn't changing. And there were many things in this example where they thought that people were going to be concerned about A, but they were actually concerned about B, and they didn't care at all about A. And what they would have done in a previous scenario is to continue go down the communication path of A, and saying that, like, keep harping, like ensuring people about something that they actually weren't worried about. Whereas now they could adapt that and speak more about what people actually were worried about, and address that at scale. So it helped with retention, like talent retention, which tends to be a big one when it comes to change. There's some good Gallup research around how 47% of top talent tends to leave an organization within 12 months of a change. So you stand to lose half of your best people when you're going through change, which is a big loss. So that's something they combated. And then, of course, you have the increased speed of execution and catching these problems early on. That was a very big win for them. So that's a typical example, and typical of what we're seeing across our customer base.
Yeah. Is there a dashboard for those changes, Nellie? When you talk about like talent retention and speed of execution, can you dashboard that?
Yeah, we can. The talent retention is a bit harder because it's so many data points, so that relies more on the organization's data, than data that we capture through TigerHall. But catching problems early, for example, is something that there are dashboards around. So that comes back to the sentiment analysis and execution, and where are people executing, where are they taking action, and so on. So that's something we have dashboards around, and then we can connect to their internal data around attrition and retention and so on. So, but that requires more of a connection than just pure TigerHall data.
And let me understand your concept of giving individuals a voice. So we tend to talk here about freedom and autonomy, which means that people can make decisions, they've got the resources that they need. But giving them a voice, maybe it's part of that, maybe it's a slightly different aspect. So is that just wanting to be heard, or is it wanting to influence the process?
Mostly it's wanting to be heard. That's what we see most of the time. Like people want to feel like they matter and that they are seen. They don't want to feel like a small number in a big organization where people don't care if they're there or not. And the larger the organization, of course, that tends to be the people who care are the ones closest to you. But even that is many times effective. But it's about feeling heard, feeling like they can share, that they have the opportunity. So even if they don't take that opportunity, just feeling that it exists makes a very big difference in their perception of leadership and their perception of the organization. So that's the biggest part. Feeling like they can influence it and like that people are taking their feedback and actioning it, because this is something that is usually a fear in big organizations, and why they don't ask for feedback is they feel like if they're getting feedback, then they need to action it and they need to do something about it, which is actually usually not the case. You would need to respond to it in some way, that's for sure. Like you can't just like give everyone's feedback and then like going completely the other direction. But if you address it in a way that people understand, you can say like, so this is what we heard from you. And many times that's what it comes down to, just communicating back that this is what we heard and we have listened, and this is what you said. This is our decision making, our rationale, and why we're doing certain things. That is sometimes many times enough for people, so they don't have to feel like I have power and I can influence this, as long as they feel like people listen to them and they actually matter in that big organization. They're not just a small number. So that's how the biggest differences are made many times.
Yeah, that's a very deep finding, actually. So let me introduce another word, Nellie, and that's culture. You read about that in the business press and books and so on like that, about culture and how it can be changed. Does all of this add up to culture? Is culture a real concept for corporations? Is it not? Can you shape it? Can you manage it? Tell us about culture.
So I think culture is it's something that everyone knows and talks about, but it's one of those things that, as we know, is very hard to measure and hard to put a finger on, and is very subjective. So I find that culture is not one of those things that people tend to overly like care about or wanting to address or prioritize. It's kind of something people think that this is, we need to have a good culture, but they don't really know what that means, and everyone has their own interpretation of what culture actually is and what it means. So I think it makes it hard to have a say like an OKR or KPI or like measuring culture, and then people do different things around it, around employee surveys and engagement tools and things like that, which sure helps to some extent. But in my experience, when it comes down to business growth and numbers and financial targets, culture is usually getting sidelined, right? So it's easy to it's easy to talk about, but harder for people to do well. And I think in my personal experience, I think culture is 70%. In my personal experience, 70% of culture is who you hire. That's a very big part. Who are the people in the organization in the first place? And then it's about how do you reward behaviors? How do you recognize people? So, and who do you fire? Who do you promote? That also sends very big signals. But recruitment is such a big part of culture, and if you don't have the right people in the organization to start with, I think it's hard. And we work with many organizations that have more of an, what you would call an old school culture, or more like hierarchical, top down, and like change resistant and difficult to change. And those cultures are usually really, really hard to change unless you bring in a radically different, usually CEO. If the CEO is not personifying that new culture that you want to drive, it's very hard to do that through like employee resource groups and different initiatives and all these other things, and behavior and values training and so on. Like it does tend to come down to leadership, and then that cascades across the rest of the organization. So not a great answer to your question, but
It is a great answer, actually. You said culture is about who. It's not about
yeah,
what.
it comes down to who. And I think it's hard to, if you have people that are all certain, like let's say we have people that are a certain personality type, and then you want to change them to something else. I think that is hard. So yeah, it tends to be a bit mushy and more difficult to overcome, I think, than people might think.
So let's get back to this concept of change management, Nellie. Some of our researchers here are trying to work on a concept we call flow, which has a couple of components to it. One is the individual component. And there's a famous philosopher who wrote a book about flow, and it's about being, as an individual, engaged and committed to a task that you think has meaning. It might be hard, but you enjoy the challenge, and it's a very kind of intense form of engagement. And there's also the flow of physics, the flow of knowledge and value and so on like that through the company, which is kind of an abstract concept, but it doesn't include planning and strategy and budgets. It's just flow, making everything flow easily. And so the concept there is that you live the change all the time. That's why I talked about Heraclitus at the beginning. And change management sounds staccato. I started here, I do it there, measuring it. So is change management an outmoded concept? Can something like flow, or whatever the right expression is, can that be a better way to think about running a corporation?
Without knowing too much detail around the flow concept, I think change management and transformation management, like the word management can be debated, but I think those departments and functions are very much needed. And we've seen a rise in change and transformation professionals over the last 5 to 10 years, because it used to be this thing where you would have someone being tapped on the shoulder and say, hey, like Hunter, you've been great with solving these problems for us. Why don't you also take on our transformation? And you might have been the CFO or CMO or any type of director before that. So it has historically been something that you've been tapped on the shoulder for and like added to your BAU as like an extracurricular or a stretch assignment to your job. And that might have worked 10 years ago when it was that one change a year per employee. Mm-hmm. But that is not working anymore, where you have this constant flow of change and transformation. It's no longer an ad hoc project type of approach. You need to have this as an always ongoing effort to constantly change and transform. And for that, I think you need dedicated professionals that have this as their full-time job. If they can do flow, probably, but I think you need dedicated teams, and having this with clear headcount budget, the way that you would run other departments. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, their role being usually reporting to the CEO is the best, and having them as a little bit of that air traffic control tower, and supporting change that is happening across the business. But the dedicated part, I think, is key.
Yeah. And those people have special skills, special experiences. How do you train them? How do you get them ready?
It's usually about like the ones that we see now in like chief transformation officer roles. They actually have very diverse backgrounds. The Executive Council for Leading Change, for example, which is an industry association that I'm leading, is over 350 chief transformation officers. And we have people from finance backgrounds, from sales, from operations, from strategy. So very diverse backgrounds. I think it more comes down to, I don't want to say personality, but like who you are as a professional and how you go about solving problems, how you communicate. And it's almost a little bit like the same qualities as we see in chief of staffs. It's a certain type of person that is a chief of staff rather than someone with a particular skill set or education or background. And that's a little bit what I'm seeing with the chief transformation officer role as well. And right now, given the rise of these change and transformation offices, you don't have any people, or not a lot of people, who have like 30 years experience in transformation. So that's why you tend to have people with diverse backgrounds coming into the role, not having those 20, 30 years of experience. And that's why it tends to be more of a personality / type of person that is in those roles. In the future, it might be more structured with like, these are the skill sets. There might be education around this, but I do think many times it will come down to your adaptability, your agility, your ability to handle change, and your ability to influence more than anything, because you don't really own anything as a change and transformation leader, right? Like, it's always the business owning the different changes, but you're there to influence and guide and coordinate and collaborate in the things we spoke about before. So can that be taught? probably. So yeah, it remains to be seen how we select these leaders in the future.
I like your idea, though, that it's a special kind of personality, and that goes with your idea of culture as people. And that makes a lot of sense to me, actually. But rather than training people on change management, get the right personalities in the right seats.
Yeah, because the danger with change management, and this is happening in some organizations today, is that it becomes this process-oriented, framework-centric type of function, and people go down the routes of their ad cars, and then they apply ad car to everything without necessarily thinking of, okay, what is the business goal here, and what is the impact we're trying to drive? So that's the risk with change management, very process, very framework, where in reality, it's more about people and influence than process and framework.
Yeah, follow these 7 steps, right?
Exactly.
That's what we want to get away from, right?
Yeah.
Good. So how should people who have a need here, have an interest, Nellie, come to you, find you, engage with you when they need your help?
So I'm active on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, Nellie Wartoft, and also on email. My email address is nellie@tigerhall.com, so that's NELLIE at tigerhall.com, so feel free to drop me an email as well. And I love chatting about these topics and how we can help in change activation, so feel free to reach out.
Good. Well, I think what you're doing is brilliant. You're taking, as you said, what was a process-oriented, top-down, almost militaristic kind of approach to change management, and you're reversing that. You're making it about people. You're making it about giving people a voice. I love that expression, and so I'm excited for you in the future. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thank you for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
This has been another episode of the Value Creators Podcast. Thanks for listening. You can visit thevaluecreators.com for links and resources related to this episode, and check out hunterhastings.com for more content on entrepreneurial business management based on value creation principles.